Okay, so we've got 2 hours. I'll try and build in a break in the middle. I'll start off by describing some of what I see as like the core sources and kind of concepts that I want to cover in this set of arguments. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I think they provide in terms of like a strategic twist, basically. Like why make this argument rather than any other criticism of IR, or not to say that you would exclusively make it, but just like what does this get you that some of the other criticisms of IR don't, okay? Please feel free to interrupt with questions, like, since I'm gonna lay out a bunch of the concepts first, I wanna make sure that we're kinda on the same page. As you saw from the demo debate, I like to kinda make sure that we've got some working definitions of where it is that we're coming from, and if we don't have that especially in hour one, then it'll be tough to talk through some of the strategic implications, okay? So, like I said, feel free, raise hand, interrupt, whatever. I think I titled this something like IR and the Anthropocene, yeah? Anybody have a working definition of Anthropocene? Yeah. Age of Humans. Okay, do you know where it comes from? Anybody know where this term comes from?
Like anthro meaning like human, and then like what's meaning like era or like age.
Yeah, these are great context clues. Kind of, I guess I'm asking, have you seen this term used in an academic sense before?
Yeah.
What? Okay, so now what context?
Climate change.
Climate change stuff. What about climate change stuff?
Like a way to describe the era of like human evolution in a context, like very new, like changing the
Yeah, this is a debate over, so it started in a debate. There's a subfield in geology called stratigraphy. Like strata, okay, like when you look at all the different layers of rocks, that's the way they started naming geological time periods. And this is the subdiscipline that's responsible for doing it. And there was a proposal in this subdiscipline to label our current era the Anthropocene, okay, as opposed to the Holocene, okay, which covers the rest of the history of humanity by a good bit. This debate then was also about like what marks this new era, and this term and kind of concept took off in a large. Now you will see it all over the place in a whole bunch of different subfields and disciplines in the academy, not just in geology, because a bunch of the social sciences, a bunch of the humanities took up this debate basically as, for one, they wanted to debate about this. So like, is there a marker for the beginning of a new era? And they wanted to capture basically the implication that we are living in unprecedented times and that there are ways of labeling those times and kind of marking their beginning that we need to account for across a whole bunch of different fields of knowledge, okay? And I am not going to get into this as a result, okay? There is an enormous amount of stuff, enormous number of articles and books that kind of either criticize this term, talk about different possible markers for the beginning of the Anthropocene, talk about its applicability. I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on that because I'll just kind of mention a couple of them here to give you some backdrop for like what people debate about. So a couple of the proposed markers, okay? The dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan at the end of World War II. The reforestation of North America post smallpox. Or the beginning of extreme change in rate of temperature increase. Okay? The thing that all of these have in common is the notion that human-centered processes would begin to have geological level effects, like effects that we would observe in geological time. Okay? And that geological time thing will play in later in the way that we're talking about some of the strategy of the argument. You could understand why, so like this is, the middle one is primarily an example of colonialism, because this reforestation is a result of the transmission of smallpox onto the North American continent. Millions of people die and forests grow again because people are no longer trying to grow nearly as much of their own food or like cultivate agricultural land in North America. The extreme change in the rate of temperature change connected to industrialization and the rise of greenhouse gas emissions, okay? That one is connected to kind of the ideology of economic growth and, like I said, the process of industrialization, atomic bombing, right? These are human implements that then leave a radioactive layer, or like radioactivity is present in the Earth's stratigraphy in a way that it never would have been absent human intervention, okay? So the common point that is trying to be captured here is the notion that humans are operating, like the level of human impact is operating, like I said, at that geological time scale, that you would be able to observe it when looking at the layers of the Earth when examining geological evidence. And I'm going to use this term primarily the way that the folks that I'm talking about it use this term, and they, you know, I don't think that, so a major criticism of the Anthropocene here is like people have proposed Capitalocene, Eurocene, like a bunch of different stuff that tries not to blame or label the agent as humanity. Most of you pointed out that anthro, right, is connected to the human, like anthropology, okay? So instead to specify a particular agent, like if what you're trying to capture is the agency of a subset of humans who are responsible for the processes that begin to have geological effects. So Eurocene would trace this to the rise of European colonialism, right? Capitalocene would treat it with the rise of a particular economic system. There are a bunch of different proposals. There are criticisms of the Anthropocene. You do not have to use this term in explaining this argument and deal with all of these different criticisms. What you have to do is capture this notion of there are, you know, human-centered, like human-caused or human systems caused, you know, some like that are a relationship to the quote natural environment that has been subject to massive change. And I wanted to talk about this set of arguments on this topic because I think of this as a topic where we are at the intersection of international relations and climate change. Okay? If you've been paying attention to most of the things that you've been reading about the Arctic, you saw our presentation from Dr. Perkins. Dupek summarized this in the topic lecture as well, right? How many of you in reading material about the Arctic thus far have encountered anything about the rate of climate change or importance of climate change in the Arctic? Raise your hand. Okay. So, if part of our backdrop for thinking about foreign policy in this area is that, you know, the Arctic is kind of this, it is a particularly, you know, that's where the rate of climate change is occurring the fastest. It is a particularly sensitive part of the Earth's overall climate system. It's also a key, you know, like is part of the kind of thermostat that regulates changes in the Earth's temperature, is covered in a couple of those talks. This is where I think we are. Yet, many of the AFs, especially in trying to find arguments about kind of why the US should act in this area, what are US interests in this area, that is in discussing US foreign policy, basically rehash past foreign policy themes. Okay? The competition over resources, the balance of power, deterrence, right? Competition over influence or norms. That is, they treat the Arctic as a spot where, you know, there is a great deal of change in the natural environment, but despite all of that change, these themes of US foreign policy, the interest that it is designed to serve, those don't really change, okay, in our approach to thinking about the Arctic. And some of the folks who are writing in international relations tend to see that exact confluence of circumstances as a serious problem. That is, we are, operating in a world in which humans are exercising this geological level of change, and yet many of our concepts for dealing with how human actors behave, what their interests are, how they ought to behave, like that, all of that stuff has stayed more or less the same rather than attempted to change to account for dramatically changing times. Okay, that is the thesis of, I put up that notion of planet politics. This set of people wrote what they called the Planet Politics Manifesto. Okay. Manifesto should indicate that this is it's a polemical document, okay? It's designed to be provocative and provide a very strong argument about an existing tradition in international relations, okay? The authors of this article, and you have access to this via, I'm going to mention a bunch of sites basically that if I were you and I were interested in cutting this argument, I would try and keep track of a bunch of the sites and people, plug those into Google Scholar. You can download all the articles while you're here at Dartmouth, probably have access to some of them in home libraries or home situations as well, and kind of pay attention to the cited by and set of terms that I'm talking about for thinking about what to go read, okay? And one of the opening paragraphs of the Planet Politics Manifesto reads as follows, okay? We agree that the global ecological crisis has torn a giant hole in the fabric of our understanding, that it is a vast tear in the real. Now our paradigms fail the real. IR, both as a system of knowledge and institutional practice, is undone by the reality of the planet. We must be in tension with status quo struggles within our disciplines and transgress academic boundaries to create conversations within activist networks and movements engaged in struggle against oppressive regimes and systems. If the biosphere is collapsing, and if IR has always presented itself as that discourse which takes the global as its point of departure, how is it that we, IR scholars, diplomats, and leaders, have not engaged with the planetary real? We contend that IR has failed because the planet does not match and cannot clearly be seen by its institutional and disciplinary frameworks. Institutionally and legally, it is organized around a managed anarchy of nation states, not the collective human interaction with the biosphere. Intellectually, the IR discipline is organized sociologically around established paradigms and research programs, likewise focused on states and the forms of international organization that they will tolerate. It is not organized to value or create the conceptual and analytical changes that are needed. The problems lie in the way we think and are trained, in the subjects and approaches in our discipline that our discipline values and rewards. Yet at the edge of IR, in NGOs, in critical geography, post-human IR, global governance, and ecological politics, a new consciousness is visible. That work cannot languish in dissidence, as so many earlier interventions have done. Okay? So this sets the stage for the larger argument that will occur here, and the one that I'm going to map out, which is, if you think of this as what they're describing as the kind of dominant themes in the existing research programs in international relations, that is the discipline designed to understand and map foreign policy between nation states, okay, that they are criticizing not only an emphasis, but also the attempt to understand the world in these terms, rather than in terms of the changing backdrop of the biosphere. Okay, so that's the core premise of this argument.
When was this article or this manifesto written?
2016. Okay, so little under 10 years ago now. And I hope the wording there is clear enough to kind of point out the way in which you might think of this as the institutional and disciplinary frameworks. And what did they say was the starting point, or the point of departure for international relations? Anybody listening to that card closely enough? So where does IR, what does it begin with according to them? What does it take as its point of departure? It's right there in the title. You gotta notice the difference here. They're gonna draw a compare and contrast. So why is this called planet politics? In contrast to what? Okay, did anybody notice in there the claim that IR aims to study the global. Okay, or the international system. With what you did with Anthropocene, do that with international. How would we understand what's going on when we say that we're studying an international system?
Relations between nations.
Right? Inter, between. National, here stands in for nation states. Okay? So, an international system, it was also in this card. Anybody notice the term, the specific disciplinary term being used for the study of the international system here? In a variety of different using a variety of different methods or even different schools in IR, they largely react to this as their way of thinking about what an international system is. They used a 2-word phrase. Anybody catch it? Managed anarchy. Why is that there? Why anarchy?
No larger governing body above the nation state that is
no enforceable legal order above the level of the nation state. Okay, often described as a self-help system, as in states, seeking interests in an international system they must find ways to help themselves. That could at times involve cooperation, but there is no legal appeal to a contract style relationship like you might have with an employer, right? Where the government might enforce the legal terms of that contract. So you can take other states to court, but the enforceability of those judgments is extremely limited.
That's what I was going to
Yeah.
ask about. So you went
Yeah.
for-
Yeah, right. There are legal entities. It's like the people who would emphasize that anarchy component, right? They would be the ones focusing on the way in which this is a self-help system. The reason that this set of people used the term managed anarchy, what school, so broadly, if you remember from DKP's topic lecture, what school in international relations would you identify as emphasizing the anarchic component of the international system? Or that the international system is anarchic? Okay, right? The realists are very fond of referring to, anarchy as a self-help system, and they'll use a different set of theories for understanding what that implies for the relationships between states. What about those who might stress the idea that anarchy is managed? So that it has normative or legal components that constrain the behavior of states, and potentially change the kind of balance of behavior that's going on in anarchy.
Would that just be states act as rational actors?
Rationality is an assumption that you could find across these different schools, right? So I remember in that topic lecture when he was talking about rationalism, right? It's rationalism might be described as there are rationalist methods that you could apply in a bunch of these different schools. They might be more confident, or people who believe in the rational, activity of states, that you can find them on kind of either side of the spectrum.
liberalism.
Talk me through that.
Well, it's liberalism is a legal international order that can create systems or structures that states that function through, and then that controls the empire.
Yeah.
Trust the system.
Exactly. Liberalism holds that there are a variety of there are a variety of gains that could be absolute. Okay? In this world, we're only dealing with relative gains. Everything is zero sum. Okay? One state's gain is another state's loss because they're all competing over power, and power can easily be conceptualized, or easily is a bit of a stretch there, but can be conceptualized according to a number of different variables like size of military, size of the economy, right? That these different features play a role in defining zero-sum competition in anarchy because there is no outside help or legal order that you could appeal to, okay? Here, absolute gains might be possible. This is characterized by, have you ever seen reference to the prisoner's dilemma? Okay, right? realists would say that the prisoner's dilemma is essentially the ultimate game that is governing a situation of anarchy, because you never have, there's no way, there are strong incentives to defect in a case in which your own survival or own interests are at stake. Okay, thus zero sumness. Over here, you might be in an iterated game. The results of the game play out over time, and so you can begin to either trust or distrust your adversary or your friend. Okay? And absolute gains are possible in part because you can manage and create systems of trust that mean that you're no longer treating certain other states in zero-sum terms. Okay? Remember, this is all by way of saying that this Planet Politics Manifesto is a criticism of understanding the international system as the focal point of study and managed anarchy as its core concept for understanding what's going on in our world. Okay? So that's another way of saying that this is a criticism of all of these schools of international relations, not only one of them, right? It isn't like, oh, our answers lie in a liberal paradigm of managing anarchy or in a realist paradigm of understanding that anarchy is an immutable backdrop for the international system. Because this is a critique of the idea that international relations has ever really dealt with the global. Okay? So instead of the international, we get the planet. As in, our politics and our study of politics ought to be organized around the notion of the planet. One example of this would be, if you'll notice from just that paragraph, that we should take the biosphere as a starting point for understanding the planetary real. Okay, was the phrase that they used. Right. And you're like, well, that's all well and good, but I don't quite understand why, this, like, are we trying to say that this set of people is unaware of the idea that they live on a planet? Like, no, that's not quite what we're getting at, right? Because it's hard to accuse this set of people as being unaware of that. What changes, or what do you think might change, if we said, well, the planetary real is the biosphere? What would that change about this kind of, what's missing potentially in this vision? Like, what in the international, why would this set of people contrast the planet with the international?
Maybe like they see themselves above the environment and that's how it's led.
Yeah. Okay. This set of people argues that understanding the world in terms of an international system has tended to treat nature, and note, okay, one other thing to notice here, I've already used this term a couple times, that international relations is housed in the social sciences, okay? In contrast to what? Like, this, now we're talking about a big division between these fields. It's like, here, if you came here to Dartmouth, you could be in the social sciences, the humanities, or the natural sciences, okay? And help me a little bit, what would determine if you're in the natural sciences versus the social sciences? Like, why are we talking about that as, like, do people understand? So, like, what fits in the natural sciences? What subdisciplines would you be in there?
Biology, physics, like anything really is like maybe like applied math even.
STEM,
I don't know.
I feel like.
Yeah, like more like STEM stuff.
Okay, astronomy, STEM, engineering, maybe a little, maybe you could be a civil engineer, might get into some boundary crossing there, but like physics, biology, chemistry, like all of those things that you named, yes, absolutely housed in the natural sciences. Versus the social sciences, what might you get?
Political science.
Political science.
History.
History is typically in the humanities rather than the social sciences, but same kind of.
Psychology.
Psychology, definitely in the social sciences, although some, it's like, that's another one where some arguments over exactly where it might be housed or what people would consider themselves.
Sociology.
Sociology, definitely in the social sciences, right there in the name, right? Okay.
Is econ?
Economics, definitely in the social sciences, okay? The fact that they have this term in common, science, suggests that this set of people shares a set of methods or approaches, like that they all would consider themselves scientists, okay, very broadly speaking, but that their object of study is different. Nature versus society, the social, okay, the natural versus the social, okay? So, do we see how in this vision, okay, part of what is being criticized here is the idea that, you know, here the social is treated as separate from nature, or like you know, Upton, you said above, okay, which is also that is actually a part of a card that I may introduce here. That is that in international relations, we have typically seen people treat nature as it's an object. It's the backdrop for the activities of states and other human actors. Thus, it is non-agential. So nature exercises no agency. Okay? Humans are the subjects who act upon objects. Those are natural objects or could be social objects. Okay? This is a fundamental, if given how broad this divide is, this set of people regard this as kind of like built very deeply into the notion that we are studying an international system. Okay? And instead, they might draw on a concept like socio-nature, hyphenated. Okay? This would be intended to draw attention to the idea that each of these terms cannot in fact be understood without the other. One example of an argument like this would be that the concept of nature as an object or as a backdrop, that is a particular society's understanding of the concept of nature, not a natural divide between society and nature, okay? As in, that isn't something that is just observed or described, that is something that is created, okay? If that is the subject of a creation, or like it's a society's creating a particular understanding of nature, no, this doesn't mean that you have to say that like anybody who makes a claim about the natural sciences is like delusional or that we are wrong about that set of observations. But, and we'll get into this in a minute, you might think very differently about what a science is or about what scientific methodologies are and about what it means to study natural phenomena, okay? And in particular, if you treated these as hyphenated, you would always be trying to account for both at the same time. Okay, any account of the natural would be embedded in the social and vice versa. Like you have to you got to account for the fact that we're embedded in the biosphere if you're going to take, kind of, rather than treat this as the backdrop, because remember, the core argument here is this is undergoing an extreme rate of change in a fashion that is due to what is the account of why this set of changes is occurring? In the Anthropocene account? Humans, right? So, socio-nature, that now these things are so thoroughly interrelated and the power of human agents is so great that not only do we need to account for the fact that any description of the natural world is also a social description, we are genuinely observing the fact that like the power exercised by social actors has natural level effects. And so, and part of what is going on here is we should not, that's the justification basically for should not separate these two, should not treat them as distinct. Okay. Let's think a little bit about, are we okay on the same page so far? Okay. I mentioned that, this notion of nature as a background, they see as pretty baked thoroughly into the pie of the study of international relations. Like that this is kind of a deep background assumption found in the division between the natural and the social sciences. So, and this is where I'm kind of getting at there are some interrelated pieces. I will skip the like how and why this set of interconnections makes sense citationally, because we don't need to go into too much detail there, okay? But let's say, in debate terms, right, let's think about some of the sources of disagreement in, like, that critical arguments are intended to raise sources of disagreement over things that are not unique consequences of the plan, but rather the underlying assumptions or values that you find in the 1AC. Okay, I'll take that as kind of my shorthand for what critiques are designed to do. Okay. Along with that, what are the areas of argument or areas of disagreement that we commonly hear about in a variety of different critical schools of thought, but we're going to apply here? What terms might I be looking for if we're talking about some of the deep assumptions that are embedded in thinking about the social sciences versus the natural sciences, or treating nature as an object, right? What categories of argument am I talking about here? Anybody have any guesses? What vocabulary terms am I looking for? Let's see if we can see what kind of disagreements. So, for instance, if we have disagreements over if nature is no longer an object and we need to be studying things that are socio-natures rather than a natural world or a society, what type of assumption or kind of like underlying view is the difference between nature and socio-nature? If it's a difference over what type of object can occur or be studied.
Like what counts as an agent?
Okay, and what type of disagreement might that be?
Maybe like a non-biological disagreement.
Yeah, like this is roughly, right, what can be or how it can be, okay? So if we have a disagreement over something as core as there's no such thing as nature separate from society, but we are always embedded in socio-natures, okay? That is an ontological disagreement. It looks to me like if the natural sciences and the social sciences agreed on the idea that they are sciences, okay, so they share a set of methods about producing truth, and this is an argument that says, well, we have an ontological disagreement about this divide between the natural and the social, that would suggest that there might be some other disagreements about the methods of study or the methods of producing truth as well. What category of argument would that be?
Epistemology.
Yeah, the study of the production of valid knowledge. I'm going to introduce a kind of third category here in a second, but do we see how, so like what, if we go back to this picture of managed anarchy and a self-help system, what ontological assumptions could we ascribe to that vision of the international system? So what objects can be in such a system?
States and like naturally trusted.
And how would we observe, if we're producing valid knowledge about nation states, what are some of the techniques that we might use for producing that type of knowledge? And you can fill in any part of this, but I want to try and put a couple of these in some of these categories.
The conditions of material power.
What type of objects would those be? If you were looking at an article from a realist in international relations describing the balance of power between the US and Russia, what are some of the things that they would try and use as evidence for the balance of power?
I icebreakers number.
Military material or assets, of which icebreakers would be an example.
Like multiplexes.
Economic stats and production, because these things would be related, right?
Influence on foreign policy.
Is that,
In the sense of like working with like, I guess working like alliance groups like BRICS, NATO, or
okay. Is that material power?
I feel like it's debatable on whether it is or isn't. Like you could say this, like it's, they can get material actions taken off of that.
See, I'm putting a little dividing line there because there we might be a bit more in the liberal or the constructivist notion that we are interpreting like ideological power or influence or soft power, right? That would be pretty, you see how we're like in a divide over the relative balance of the importance of these factors, yeah? But do we see how it's like arguments over whether or not we could measure these, that they do exist, etc. Like those are arguments on the same terms. Does that make sense? Like those are arguments within, they're about the kind of like, well, which paradigm should we adopt? They are not disagreements over the fact that we are arguing from within a paradigm in which nation states, some element of it, like whether or not these things are real could be a subject of dispute, but ultimately we're trying to prove that they are real or treat them as real in basically the same way. Okay?
Like human capital.
Yeah, we could, you know, I wanted some examples here for thinking about this. What about episteme or epistemology? What could we say here?
Like the production of scientific knowledge.
So, okay, so what, well, there's one version that puts that here, right, which is like, probably for those of you who debated the IPR topic last year, right, those measures of like how many patents are being produced by a given country as a measure of its innovative capacity, right, the like, what is the status of entrepreneurialism in a given society? Are those states competing with one another? Like, those could be examples of things that you'd put in this bucket, but there's also a different, it's like science and production of scientific knowledge, we might also have an epistemic argument about that. What would that be? So if I go into your average government department or political science, and I'm like, well, you know, God ordains that the world works in a particular way, and so any study of international relations and ethics really has to begin with a theological examination of, you know, what we can understand from the fundamental religious texts, in my case, the Bible, like, and that organizes our study of international relations. What problem am I going to encounter?
Like probably they want empiricism, positivism, and like
One example of this would be to apply hypothetico-deductive methods to the study of social phenomena, okay? So like, I imagine you all have encountered the idea of like writing out a hypothesis and testing it, yeah? What class did you do that in?
Science.
Okay. Have you had that in social studies or in any part of classes about government? Okay, well, imagine that you had a bunch of people who are, and when you do that in science class, why are you doing it that way? Other than my teacher told me that I had to. Like, what are you trying to do?
We're trying to test whatever, like, the independent variable is. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. I can, like, elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, go for it.
So, there's always, like, going to be some sort of independent variable that's changing, and the dependent variable is how we're measuring it. And normally it's like the effect of X on Y. So we're just testing like what we're essentially using is like natural sciences typically to like test.
You might be interested in studying causation in a monocausal way. A causes B, right? Are we trying to establish what causes what? Yeah. And our hypothesis, here's the other thing. I'm gonna guess that some of you at some point have done a science class where it's like you're testing to get the value of like gravitational pull or acceleration, right? Like incline. How many of you have used an inclined plane in science class to like measure the speed of different objects moving down an inclined plane? Okay, right? So like, what are you trying to do there? Are you trying to demonstrate that the ball rolls at a certain speed only in your science class? So what are you trying to do?
Extrapolating outwards for the entirety of just the planet.
Okay, you're trying to establish law-like behavior, or also observations that are acontextual, as in they do not depend on a particular context. Yeah? So like, gravity is gravity no matter where you are. Well, if you're in a Newtonian system, gravity is gravity wherever you are. Okay? Law-like behavior, what do I mean by that? Like what is a natural law?
It means like undeniable, or it's like undeniable, which means it doesn't exist in the
All instances, okay? And right, this is part of a feature of the natural sciences, at least in some of their conventional conceptions, that you would establish law-like observations, right? You are trying to establish natural laws, things that we know to be true regardless of circumstance and regardless of time period, yeah? There is a fairly significant part of, so you all mentioned, one of the things that you mentioned in the social sciences discussion, or like what are examples of the social sciences, one of you pointed out political science, okay? What does it, if you are discussing yourself or like portraying yourself as a political scientist, what does that imply then if these are some of the features of a scientific method of discovery?
You give hypotheses of how like political actors will act in certain scenarios and try to create like a formula, like a law for like how people act in certain scenarios.
Okay. Remember, what might be an example that we have on the board for kind of a particular paradigm in the political sciences trying to portray the way in which certain actors will always behave? That is, they will display law-like behavior. Okay?
Anarchy.
The prisoner's dilemma is an example of an attempt to make a claim about the behavior, right? Because the prisoner's dilemma is an argument about, it is only contextual insofar as it assumes that this is our situation. But it says in that situation, the problem of defection is basically impossible to overcome. Zero-sum relationships are characteristic of the relationships in an international system. So if you're dealing with relationships between states, that means that you are dealing with an anarchic system that is a self-help system, and we can deduce that there are law-like behaviors that will occur in such a system, including defection, because the interests of given states, because they are zero-sum, they will behave in certain ways that we can understand through the, basically treating their behavior as comprehensible in a game-like system that obeys certain law-like behaviors. We on board for this? Okay. If this is an ontological disagreement about the very building blocks of what it is that we are using to think about anything that we observe, what does that imply for some of that?
it'll be distinct because the way they start is different.
What do you mean by that?
Because I guess even if you applied similar deductive methods, the assumptions that they take with the level of actor and what can act means that the results will be a little bit different.
Okay, you're getting there. So if this is, because do we see how this is a critique of the idea that we can begin with nature as a backdrop that is separate that we could observe, meaning the analogy of like, we're going to study politics like the natural sciences study nature. Well, if we can't take that as our given backdrop for thinking about the world around us or our observations about that world, because we aren't just observers, we are also participants, then attempting to establish completely contextual observations of law-like behavior or to map the social sciences, or something like political science or IR, which is a subset of political science, trying to map that onto the techniques and methods of the natural sciences is a category error. Like, it should not be done because you cannot study these phenomenon as though they were things that could be observed as you would in the natural sciences, because the natural sciences and the social sciences take this divide between society and nature as fundamental. Okay. So, back to the Planet Politics Manifesto. Okay. Where's my card that I want here? Sorry. Sorry, pulled up a couple docs. When prepping, this was a mistake. Should have kept the one. Okay. So, I'm gonna read a hopefully not too long link card about, because remember, we had as an example here that you might study the balance of material power, yeah? How many affirmatives that you are going to debate at the camp tournament make some claim about the ability to understand and deduce the effects of a particular balance of power? Can we name any of them? Okay, so anti-submarine warfare, right? Like, anti-submarine warfare is an attempt to translate the foreign policy objectives of deterrence into particular material capacities and the overall balance of power.
Like every atom is about like how the world functions.
I agree that, at the highest level of abstraction, I introduced this extremely high level of abstraction. So like you are pointing out that we could read this about a lot of different things. I'm going to focus on the balance of power for a moment, just as like a subset of this.
Arctic Command Joint Interagency Task Force.
Arctic Command.
Would this apply to like counter memories, which has an ingrained idea of these type of parts, or is that so?
I reflect my same comment that I had for Upton, which is that I introduced this problem and you all are calling me on. You said that this is basically applicable to everything. There are some counter memory, or some of these might introduce actually some questions that we would be curious about in this context. But
The Japanese icebreakers,
icebreakers, ice pact, BMD, right? Okay. Notice when I mentioned way back at the beginning about kind of translating conventional foreign policy themes into what this set of people regards as a fundamentally changing era in terms of our role as, investigators of the world and analysts of policy, okay? They also then problematize whether or not we could basically establish law-like behaviors. So for instance, do we see that claims about deterrence are ultimately an underlying understanding about how a rational actor behaves in the face of a particular balance of power in a way that functions almost as a law in international relations informing foreign policy, because only an irrational actor would act in certain ways, and states are rational, or we assume that they are rational, therefore the other states will respond to the plan in a particular way. Yeah? Like, that is a way of categorizing a lot of the AF advantage claims that you all have named for this set of affirmatives. Okay? So what if instead we said the following, or like we had this as a disagreement. So this isn't from the Planet Politics Manifesto, but this is from two of the authors of the Planet Politics Manifesto writing in a book called Anthropocene Encounters New Directions in Green Political Thinking. Okay? So This chapter focuses on how power in the Anthropocene does not merely express relations between people or governments, but functions across entangled domains of institutions, ecologies, and things. We'll talk about entangled in a moment here. But do we see how an entangled set of institutions, ecologies, and things, do we get why that is part of this socio-nature argument? If we treat those things as inseparable, i.e. institutions and ecologies are linked together, then that's a claim about socio-nature. It doesn't use that word, but do we get that? Okay. We'll get to entanglement in a second. Okay. That are connected to more than human intention and influence. As in, this is an argument about whether or not the natural world, or the world around us, should be understood as non-agential, okay? Because it is referring to more than human relations and influence. As such, this chapter can be seen as a contribution to political theory in its classical and green guises. Okay, in the face of the profound planetary ecological crisis and the paradigmatic shift wrought by the concept of the Anthropocene, traditional concepts and practices of power in IR are dangerous. Two concepts in IR are the twin poles of anarchy and hierarchy, which imagine world politics simultaneously as an eternally competitive and ungoverned space of estrangement. What's that? Eternally competitive and ungoverned space of estrangement. Give me a short word for that. Anarchy. Okay. As do we see eternally? That's law-like, right? It will always be this way. Okay. Sorry, which order did they do? Eternally. Oh, I lost my place. Oh yeah, eternally competitive, ungoverned, right? Anarchy, as in can't appeal to an overall space of government. Estrangement. What's that word doing there?
Like, students are like, communicate with trust.
Trust is not possible, right? But like that, it's not an iterated game. So they are not actors that are acting in common with common understandable terms, except insofar as they share an understanding of power. Okay. And as minimally ordered by, okay, so that's one. And as a minimally ordered by structures of hegemony and alliance. Which would that be? That'd be managed, right? That's the claim, for instance, if you say U.S. predominance caps escalation, do we understand that we are making a claim about the way in which a minimally managed space of anarchy displays certain features that a purely anarchical space does not? And we're making it on the basis of hierarchy. That is, you need a predominant power in order to produce security. So these are the twin poles that are being criticized in this card. Given their constitutive power, these concepts are anachronistic in an epoch in which social nature is rebounding brutally on humanity with uncontrollable power. So social nature, notice, that's this, okay? What was that argument about constitutive power? What's that word constitutive doing there?
Like what constitutes something?
Okay, what is that? Give me an analogy, like where do you see this root show up? Constitutive. What word does that sound like that we might be more familiar with? With, right? Con is in there, so like something's with something else. Like constitution, okay, right? What does a constitution do? Like what makes the Constitution separate from like?
It has like a set of outlines without like governance.
Okay.
It's like, for example, in the U.S., the Constitution's like the supreme law of the land, so it's like kind of like the country's highest governing document.
All of the other law, like it sets the boundaries that all other laws must obey. It founds the country, it founds the set of things that then govern everything else. So if we're speaking here about the constitutive power of a concept, okay, if we think of this anarchy, oh, I forgot I erased anarchy. But if we think of anarchy or hierarchy as examples of the constitutive power of concepts in international relations, do we see how it's like, if we are political scientists who are trying to discover law-like behaviors, and what is constitutive of the international system is that it is a system of managed anarchy, all of our other observations about the law-like behaviors of these different actors or the way in which they will perform is based on that fundamental understanding of what the world is. It is an anarchic system. Okay? So this is an argument, and note, somebody already pointed this out, that a constitution requires a what? Like, to constitute, what is, constitute is it's a verb, so that requires an actor, okay, right? So that means that this is an argument about the way in which, instead of just observing that the world is anarchic, we should instead treat this as a claim by particular actors that the world should be understood as anarchic. So this gets back to the observer is embedded, not neutral. This isn't a descriptive claim like you would find in a classic model of the natural sciences, and if IR is being analogized to the natural sciences, you would try and usually treat anarchy as something that is like, that's descriptive, I'm not adding anything to that description, I am observing it. Does that make sense? Okay. So this would say, instead of observing that, you are constituting it. The actor is shaping the world that they are a part of rather than just reflecting it. Okay? So this gets into some stuff that will be about the kind of position of what it is that we're doing when we make, if we could make observations, what we're doing. Okay. So given their constitutive power, these concepts are anachronistic, right? Inappropriate for the times. In an epoch in which social nature is rebounding brutally on humanity with uncontrollable power, dangerous because when translated into practices and institutions, deepened the appalling ecological crisis facing the earth. The exercise of power politics has worsened conflict, protected and exacerbated the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, and compromised and weakened global ecological governance. Yet the power thus exercised is increasingly spectral, as an anthropocentrically affected biosphere is turning back violently on states and humanity with a power that mainstream social science cannot yet properly conceptualize and states cannot control. Okay? At the same time, the classical idea of sovereignty operative in power politics and embedded fundamentally in international law and global governance, which sees power located and contained in a bounded body politic. What's that? Well, I'll pause for a second. What's a bounded body politic in this? What term have we been using for that? Not quite. Nation states, right? Bound, like there's a boundary, okay, body politic, that is, this is a political body. What were you asking a question?
What was the name of this book you're reading?
Like, there's a card in here. Anthropocene Encounters, New Directions in Green Political Thinking. It's by, the editors are Anthony Burke and Stephanie Fischel, who are also two of the authors of the Planet Politics Manifesto. That power is exercised increasingly spectral as an anthropocentrically affected biosphere is turning back violently on the states, yada yada. Oh, yeah, sorry. A bounded body politic is subject to and constitutive of the state must also be rethought. The state imagined as Leviathan, a metaphorical figure of the great human, is the ultimate anthropocentrism, utterly divorced from the air it might breathe, the cosmos from which it draws its atomic complexity, the living materiality of its territory, and the biosphere it depends upon for its survival. This figure, like the image in the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan, towering over its sovereign territory, can only embody mastery over nature. Can a global order built on this figure truly grapple with the Anthropocene? Okay. Do you know who Hobbes' Leviathan? Do we know about the Leviathan? Okay, you probably learned about it as an example of a social contract theory, right? Hobbes says once you've signed the social, you probably covered Hobbes versus Locke, right? In a civics class, like Hobbes, you can't revolt. Locke, maybe you can. American revolutionaries might have been interested in a theory that said you can revolt. Okay, so we got that covered. The Leviathan, right, is this idea of like the state is composed of a whole bunch of different individuals who, because they have ceded the right of the use of force to the state, right, in exchange for their own security, they have escaped the state of nature. Okay, notice they're escaping the state of nature into a state of the social. The social is above the natural and not dependent upon it. So this image of nation states as possessing material power, influence, alliances, human capital, etc., all of the set of resources, this set of people accuses that basically of being totally divorced from the ecological context, or the notion that these institutions are simultaneously ecologies. We should evaluate these institutions in part for the type of ecology that they are embedded in and that they are capable of creating. So the argument, and I'll skip down here a couple paragraphs, okay? Whom or what power is assumed to be exercised by generates an ontological account of the units and the structure of the system, and a matching ethics. What power, in a moral rather than a strategic sense, is meant to be for. Hence, the dominant account in realist IR theory that the key limits of the international system are states, and that power is exercised by them. This is a particular narrowed image of the anthropos that struggles vainly to imagine humanity as a moral or political entity, and to which the biosphere as a moral or physical entity is almost entirely invisible. The question of what and whom power is to be exercised for is properly an ethical one, going beyond the strategic aims of states to what the overarching purposes of international society, order, and governance should be. Morgenthau, in his, remember, where did we encounter Morgenthau earlier in the camp? Anybody remember? DKP's topic lecture. He had that picture of the three, who were the three people? Anybody remember? Morgenthau, Greenspan, I don't remember the third off the top of my head. It wasn't, in this, there was a picture of Kant in that slide deck, but not there. Okay. Morgenthau is one of the progenitors of realist international theory. Okay, so that's what needs to be referenced here. The notion of politics as a struggle for power remains at the core of IR. Morgenthau defines power as man's control over the minds and actions of other men, and at the international level argues that all states must seek to maximize power. Therefore, international politics can be conceived of as analyzed as a struggle between independent units seeking to dominate others. In a crucial, ontologically powerful move, Morgenthau distinguishes political power from man's power over nature, or the means of production and consumption, and insists that power rests on an idea of politics as an autonomous sphere of action. A radical division between politics and other spheres enacts the constitutional modern divide between the natural and the social world. Okay? So that balance of power theories that treat the international system as something that is governed by law-like behavior, in which the study of what can be and which objects and actors are relevant generally focuses on nation states and their material power, occurs against the backdrop of treating nature and ecology as entirely separate from a set of international politics, because those states are not treated as embedded in socio-natures. They are treated as social and political entities that are separate from any observation about or constrained by the natural world. Okay. We'll come back to a couple of the strategic implications here. Let's do a 5-minute break and come back at 10:15. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the strategic implications of various parts of this argument. We'll get into some of what we're trying to achieve. I have one other big kind of concept and set of sites to introduce right before we're launching into that, okay? Which is a word that we have not kind of unpacked here, is this notion of entangled, okay? So when we were talking about hypothetico-deductive methods and kind of the assumptions of the physical sciences found in some of these models for the social sciences, okay? The part of what's going on there is we are building in some very basic ontological assumptions about the world, as well as epistemic ones, in terms of how we're going to observe that world or figure out something that can be said about it. And do you know what this word entangled is doing here? It's meant to, what's it trying to draw our attention to? Yeah.
It's that the two things are intertwined. They're not necessarily, they can't be separated from each other.
Okay, so against an assumption of separability, okay, the contrasting term that is often used here is a relational account of the world, as in to understand any one component, you are discussing the relations between those components rather than something that is divisible in its entirety onto its own. Okay? So, put it this way. In the social sciences, we probably have a lot of ideas about where we can find some relational accounts of the world. Yeah? In the sense that, like, either, like, for instance, anytime you read Marx, you are making some relational arguments about the world, because Marx's fundamental argument is that the commodity form is a relationship, okay? The commodity form is social, so you can't, like, instead of breaking it apart into the stuff that got made and the people who made it, you should be thinking of those as a relationship, okay? And that relationship is a mode of production. That's an example of a relational argument that you might find in the social sciences or the humanities. Given that this set of folks is trying to say, well, that division between the social sciences and the natural sciences, or in society and nature, might itself be a problem, do we know any place where we could find the language of entanglement or relationality in the natural sciences? Yeah. Okay. This set of people is alluding to quantum. This is a part of the argument that you could choose to bite off if you wanted to. It is a rather hefty meal, okay? So just, I'm giving you that heads up. If you wanted to, a couple of the authors and sites in IR that you would think about for relational IR, Kirky, and let me make sure I'm spelling Kowalski correctly, sorry. Kowalski, yeah. Kowalski and Kirky are two major authors who have written about the kind of relational component of international relations. In particular, if you want a contrast with kind of a balance of power or atomistic account of states and their behaviors, that is a place that you could go, okay? And it fits fairly well with this argument. This set of people, neither of these people wrote or like signed on to the Planet Politics Manifesto when it was originally published, but there are some connected concepts and papers here that you would want to explore. I'm not going to try and define or read like what all of that would sound like. Okay, quantum. If you wanted to do anything with this, the cited by or the place to go first is a guy named Alexander Wendt. Wendt was was the preeminent constructivist in like the 90s and early 2000s. Okay, he is famous for coining the phrase, famous in the academic sense. Okay, he's famous for coining the phrase, "Anarchy is what states make of it." Anarchy is what states make of it, which, back when before we erased the managed component of anarchy, right? You could see how that would stress the like, anarchy is something that can be managed and ultimately could potentially be escaped via construction of iterated norms, procedures, like you can get out of, and you can make anarchies into something different than just zero-sum competition. Okay, that's kind of his constructivist set of arguments. He has subsequently written like a tome on let me make sure that I get the title correct. Quantum Mind and Social Science. Quantum Mind and Social Science. And like a basic component of this set of arguments is that the physical sciences model for the social sciences is Newtonian. I don't know if we can get this one quote quickly. What, does anybody know the characteristics of a Newtonian system or account of the world to contrast it with either quantum or a relativistic account of the world?
A lot of the laws are always universal.
Okay, universality, right? So there isn't a relativistic universe, which also means that time and space are treated as absolutes, not as relative, right? So like the Einsteinian construction of space-time that puts those two things together, right, and says that there is a fabric of space-time. You've probably seen the diagrams of like a gravity well. Maybe you watched Interstellar and then like tried to think a little bit about that. I don't know. Okay, that like plot point where they go down to the very heavy gravitational moon and come back. It's like, oh, relativistic speeds and relativistic gravity, right? You're in a world where time is passing differently because time passes in relative frame rather than absolute. Okay. Einstein actually had a famous kind of quarrel with quantum, so we're talking about something that is very different even from an Einsteinian relativistic universe. Does anybody know, especially when we talk about entanglement, what some of the kind of components of quantum disagree with a Newtonian account of the world, and also maybe a relativistic Einstein?
Quantum kind of talks about how sometimes it's all dependent on the observer. So, like, events can be distant depending on whether they're observed or not.
We don't have much time to go into some of the like details of these concepts, but yes, here that observation, so this is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that you can't know both the position and velocity of certain subatomic units. Like to observe them is to change one or the other. Like you can know one with certainty, but not both at the same time with certainty, meaning that you are dealing with an entirely probabilistic account of the world in which you have probabilities that are affected by observation, but you can only ever know the probability, you can only ever know a distribution of probability in advance. Observation is the thing that collapses that function down to, it's like, are we familiar with some of this language-ish, maybe? Schrodinger's cat, superposition, the cat is dead and not dead at the same time until the moment of observation, because you're collapsing the wave function. Something would behave as either a particle or wave. This is the thought experiment that Schrodinger comes up with, ironically, to try and prove that quantum doesn't really make sense. And then people are like, oh, the Schrodinger's cat thing, okay? It's like action at a distance, okay, or entanglement. That is that we see like the spin of different subatomic particles change even though they are not seemingly not connected to one another, or like not connected in a way that we understood in a previous paradigm for understanding the natural world. And the notion of superposition as well means that something like a foundational aspect of all of these other kind of scientific claims, deep down at its core, you can't be A and not A at the same time. Something has to be divisible and thus has an identity. So the principle of identity, A equals A, right? And A must be not A. You can't be A and A at the same time. Well, this messes with that because if something can exist in superposition, then it actually can be itself and not itself at the same time. This is not a requirement of this argument. The strategic role that this adds, okay, if you're reading arguments about, and here I'm going to get into, like I said, some of the kind of strategic function of, sorry, I should not have erased that thing first, but let's talk a little bit about the strategic role that this argument plays that makes it different from some of the other criticisms of international relations that we might find, okay? We pointed out some shared features, right? It has a criticism of ontology, of the ontology that you find in mainstream international relations, and thus also mainstream foreign policy understandings, and the epistemic basis for producing the knowledge in that subfield or discipline. Yeah, that's a shared feature. Some different features, okay? I want you to name, it's like, give me some of the most common 2AC arguments versus various versions of critiques of security and international relations. Like, I imagine you're planning to debate this set of arguments, so like, let's talk about some of them. Yeah.
That's a real.
Classic. Actually, I won't abbreviate that like realism, just abbreviate it like that. Okay, some other categories. I'm too tired to give this to AC. we just have 2AC1.
I'm like, gonna hate it, like, realism, like, predicting how states behave. Like, you can predict what China and Russia will do, which I guess lies in that's
Realism as an example of that, right? That you might say, this is the set of things that makes it possible to make this set of predictions. Okay.
Ireflexive.
What else?
answer to impacts.
I'll skip a step and I'll write down what you're all thinking when you say that. You tell me if I'm wrong. Did I get it right? Okay. We're not getting super creative with that one, but that's okay. I like that you try. I like that you tried. You're like, I think that Turner probably doesn't want to hear extinction outweighs. I don't know if that's what you were doing, but we're skipping right there. Okay. Do we have anything else that we want to add to this category? Okay. Oh, yeah. Go for
I
it.
guess like when you're answering it, you're definitely gonna want to try and look for some like deficits to like the alternative.
Yep. Right. Okay. We have our typical 2AC. So first, what is the tone? I'm going to group these three arguments first. What is an underlying assumption or a point of contrast that is usually drawn between these three arguments and the negative argument? So like what distinction does this ultimately rely on?
Our model of IR versus the negative model of IR.
And why? Let's bear down on this a little bit. What is characteristic of our model versus your stupid hippie stuff?
Realism.
And okay, so talk to me more about like what is important to know about that model for the purposes of these cards.
Like that we can predict that the models we have to predict other actors are accurate and true.
Okay, but why?
Because our model is based on true statements, true understandings of the world.
And
Our epistemology.
and why is okay, right? Because this is a social science that can make predictions about law-like behavior. Yeah?
Would you say it's like the model posits that it's desirable to achieve absolute security, or besides?
Well, that's more like we can name and we can identify states as rational actors. Yeah. Those two assumptions are often made together, because in order to study them in producing law-like behavior, we would most often need to make a rational actor assumption. Does anybody notice anything different that we can say about this argument that we might usually not be in a position to say? If let's say that we take on the quantum portion of this, or we at the very least make this, if we make this style of criticism, of which quantum is one of the examples of the alternative, of like an alternative conception, what argument do we have that we might not have had before? So like, your post-structuralist criticism of international relations, right, can't make this argument.
Like the scientific foundation order model is an anchor.
Okay, so we can basically make a set of arguments about the status of science, and like taking on quantum, part of the goal for doing that would be to say you do not meet the criteria for a genuine scientific theory of knowledge. Okay, just like I hope, and maybe this is not Evan, but just like I think of that as a powerfully different argument. It's not that the post-structuralists don't have any arguments about the constitutive or constructive nature of scientific observation. They clearly do. But one of the things that this argument could permit that others would not is the appeal to an alternative, scientifically grounded understanding of the world. So like if you make the arguments about quantum or embeddedness and entanglement, you can make the argument that it's like, even if science is a criteria for thinking about, prediction, for thinking about how it is that we ought to understand the world, you do not meet the criteria that you have established, rather than those criteria are undesirable. Does that make sense? So like you get an argument that doesn't require winning, basically, that we should not be attempting to make connections between social and natural sciences, and instead you'd be making the opposite. So like we need to make connections between the social and natural sciences, but the natural sciences model that is currently employed in the social sciences is wrong, basically. Like the underlying analogy to the international system as a system that basically works as a Newtonian one is inaccurate. Like that's a reason that model will never give us what we want, including making the argument that like if the act of observation is relevant in all circumstances, so like you can't know the world purely in a descriptive fashion, then that automatically means that the AF's claim to like we are making no normative judgments, we are just observing the behavior of these other actors. If you accept a number of these arguments, that is not possible. So theory automatically plays a constitutive role in the world rather than purely an observational one that can distinguish between the observer and the observed. Okay. One other site or kind of like concept that I want to mention here. In researching this set of stuff, there are a set of people interested in discussing the cosmological component of various social theories of the world. Okay, cosmology here, I'll give you a definition real quickly from this book. So this Bentley Allen is like a relatively young IR scholar. I want to give his kind of definition of cosmology, and then we'll talk about its strategic role and why it's connected to this argument. So this is from his book, Scientific Cosmology and International Orders. Okay. On my conception, cosmologies weave ideas about what counts as knowledge and what exists, so epistemology, ontology, into broader narratives about the origins and operations of the universe. Defined broadly, a cosmology is any composition or cultural construct relating to the structure or process of systems of creation, the origins of physical elements of earthly or astronomical spheres, the genesis of the material world, the order and function of the observable universe. Drawing on this definition, I think of cosmologies as comprised of ideas about the fundamental units of matter, the forces that govern them in the categories of representation, ontology, the modes and procedures likely to produce reliable or true knowledge of the universe, episteme, the nature and direction of time, temporality, the origins and history of the universe, cosmogony, the role or place of the humanity in the cosmos, destiny. On this conception, cosmologies are not integrated totalities that are understood and internalized by all members of a group. Rather, they are compositions or configurations of cosmological elements that circulate in discourses. That is, your kind of K. Pryor style argument can wrap in a bunch of ontological and epistemological disagreements while making those. I'll skip a step and explain that he regards the cosmology of most international relations as Newtonian, as in It has a depiction about how time and space operate, the valid production of knowledge, that it is concerned with the origins of the universe. It's like that is a cosmological vision, okay? And he and some of the other folks writing in this area, okay, the relational theorists that I put up there early, Kirky and Kowalski, okay, all of these folks basically have part of this argument that we can make about the desirability or possibility of using a Newtonian style scientific model as our underlying understanding of an international system, okay, in which states are basically billiard balls bouncing around. Like that's the classical Newtonian system is the billiard ball of, like, you know, the Newtonian laws of motion. You can illustrate those basically in that style of system. This set of people argues that claims about the balance of power, something that, as we pointed out, many AF advantages on this topic rely on that underlying concept. You can criticize that underlying concept as it is not scientific, it is anti-scientific. It is grounded in a cosmology that sees the world as one in which space and time are absolute. It has a kind of depicted ordering notion of the universe in a way that constitutes that world as divided between the social and the natural, okay? Meaning that this set of folks also writes, and Alan in particular, writes an argument about the importance of social scientists for establishing our overall picture of the world, okay? So when anybody makes any kind of positioning style argument on planned focus, they are arguing implicitly that we are observing the world and the causal effects of a particular action in the world. Yeah, that's the goal. The role of the judge is to basically evaluate unique consequences of a particular action. Yeah. If we have this alternative account of how social scientists or other intellectuals are connected to observations about the world as their role is constitutive, not merely observational, then we have arguments about why, in occupying that position, that the ontological and epistemic claims that we make are of particular importance. Basically, you can concede or use a bunch of these arguments about, yes, the judgments of different scholars and politically, like, you don't have to go for policy making bad. You don't have to go for state bad. You don't have to go for social science bad. You go for alternative models of these things are actually very powerful and useful because our constitutive claims about the world, the cosmological assumptions that we employ in discussing the world of international relations, have a very important effect on that world. Okay? Just give you a sample card from Alan. Okay? The Anthropocene, remember way back, Planet Politics, Anthropocene, different era, need to make new assumptions. The Anthropocene has cosmological significance. Ecological sciences introduce new ontological and epistemic elements by reconceptualizing physical processes. The Earth is not governed by the classical laws of linear mechanism, but by nonlinear dynamism of the complexity sciences. Since these processes are only partially knowable and predictable, the Anthropocene challenges rationalist and modernist epistemic ideas. If the Earth is not fully knowable, it is not fully controllable. The Anthropocene broadens time horizons, situating humanity within long time horizons, parochializing the present. We are called to see the present industrial order as a moment in a long history of human political configurations. The Enlightenment historical sciences were linear. By contrast, ecology and complexity theory depict a world of active, nonlinear, and chaotic processes. The dominant temporality in Earth systems would not be the linear development of Darwinian cosmology, but a dynamic interplay of organic and inorganic matters. A cosmological shift should enter the associational basis of international order through horizontal change. Ongoing associational changes will have had to generate a cosmological backdrop that could orient associations toward common ecological purposes. The Anthropocene introduces a constellation of new cosmological elements to redefine state purpose. It places humanity within geologic time and structures nonlinear narratives of nature. It undermines representations of human mastery over nature. Social scientists play a central role in the patterns of knowledge production shaping the future of cosmology and international order. This finding cuts against the distinction between facts and values in the social sciences. It creates a new way to understand reflexivity and postpositivism in the social sciences. Experts are only likely to have major short-run effects on policy under highly specific conditions. However, the argument here shows that over the long run, social and political knowledge operates as a form of productive power that structures the discursive landscape of politics. that beliefs can form the ontological, epistemic, and cosmological presuppositions that they channel into political conversations. Social scientists reproduce certain ideas that are then disseminated through teaching, government service, and forays into the public sphere. Cosmological developments are central to the politics of the future. The articulation of new cosmologies is an important political task. Social scientists may have a duty to participate in the construction of new cosmologies. Such cosmologies will shape the future of international order in an age of ecological crisis. As in, you take all of these arguments and instead of saying policy making bad, science impossible, can't do any of this stuff, you're like, well, we need different understanding of the scientific basis for doing any kind of model of socio-nature rather than nature and the social as totally separate entities. We can participate in the growing reflexivity that people exercise over the long term by talking about and understanding the underpinnings of international order, right? You're kind of internal link turning a bunch of these arguments that are typically contested instead by policy making bad, or like don't occupy the role of the state, don't occupy the role of the policymaker. So totally different in terms of a number of 2AC arguments that are very common, okay? Impact. What is different about the impact here?
The impact is climate change, so you have extinction.
In a high magnitude environment, like this argument does not say we should not consider existential risks. It says we have gotten the category of existential risk entirely wrong, in part because our causality and our understanding of what's going to cause what and what will secure what is backwards. That is, if the biosphere and biophysical limits are crucial for understanding our place in the world and our role in it, right? You're basically making a bunch of these root cause arguments about a high magnitude impact rather than trying to say that high magnitude risks should be ignored. So it's another kind of like you've taken the opposite tack, or like your internal link turning something that usually you are trying to impact turn. Okay. Hopefully some of this stuff in terms of like thinking about permutations, that we see that because we're making a bunch of arguments about like, well, these are fundamentally different pictures of the world and they have incompatible underlying assumptions, okay? We're no longer talking about like our alternative as basically a counterplan to ban security. So the double bind style arguments ought to be less appealing